The most important Psykers in the Warhammer 40K universe aren't the ones ripping tanks apart with their minds. They're the ones making sure the Imperium doesn't collapse into 10,000 isolated star systems overnight. From battlefield sorcerers to god-tier entities sitting on golden thrones, today we're breaking down every type of Psyker in the 40K universe, starting with the ones nobody thanks, astropaths. Without astropaths, the Imperium of Man does not exist. That's not dramatic flair. That is a literal statement of fact. No faster than light communication means no coordinated fleets, no orders from Terra, no empire. Just a million planets screaming into the void with zero idea what's happening next door, where astropaths are the galactic postal service, and they are the only reason anything works. A single astropath can relay psychic messages across light years through the warp. Those signals degrade over vast distances and can take days or even weeks to arrive depending on warp conditions. Scale that up to the astropathic choirs on major worlds, and you've got a network loosely coordinating military operations across the entire galaxy. Thousands upon thousands serve across the Imperium's organizations, making them one of the most numerous specialized Psyker types in existence. Here's where it gets dark. Every single one of them goes through the ritual of soul binding, where they're brought before the Emperor himself and psychically bound to his will. The process burns out their eyes, not as a side effect, as a direct consequence of being exposed to the Emperor's unfathomable psychic presence, which is either the greatest honor a Psyker can receive or the most dystopian onboarding process in human history. Probably both. And that's the tone for today. Even the boring utility Psykers in 40K live absolutely nightmarish lives, but at least astropaths get to keep their sanity. The next group on our list doesn't always get that luxury. Sanctioned Psykers. Think of sanctioning as the Imperium's version of a hall pass, except instead of skipping gym class, this one stops people from putting a bolter round through your skull, which is, a slightly higher stakes situation. Here's how it works. Every Psyker the Imperium doesn't immediately execute gets shipped off to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, where they undergo a process that makes basic training look like a spa day. Purity testing, doctrinal indoctrination, binding rituals. They poke around in your brain, make sure nothing from the warp has already set up shop in there, and then brand you with a sanctioning mark. That mark is basically your please don't shoot me badge. Without it, you're an unsanctioned Psyker. And unsanctioned Psykers get exactly one thing from the Imperium: a summary execution. The actual number of sanctioned Psykers serving across the Imperium at any given time is deliberately kept vague, but every source agrees on one thing: there are nowhere near enough. The Imperium spans a million worlds. The ratio of sanctioned Psykers to planets is laughably small, not exactly flooding the market, but here's the thing: sanctioning reduces the risk of warp corruption. It does not eliminate it. Your brain is still a doorway to literal hell. The rituals just put a slightly sturdier lock on it. This has led to a pretty heated community debate about whether sanctioning actually does anything meaningful, or if it's just ritualistic security theater designed to make everyone else feel better about standing next to a psychic bomb. Either way, the result is the same. Sanctioned Psykers are simultaneously the most trusted and most disposable members of Imperial society, useful enough to keep alive, expendable enough that nobody files paperwork when one disappears, and most of them fall into a very specific power bracket, which brings us to the Psykers the Imperium considers average, Delta/Gamma Psykers. Welcome to the middle management of psychic power. Delta and Gamma Psykers aren't leveling cities or peering through time. They're influencing a small group of people, maybe locking down a single target reliably, and then going home with a nosebleed. And honestly, they're the ones keeping the Imperium running. These two tiers make up a significant chunk of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's active roster. The vast majority of every sanctioned Psyker you've ever read about in a codex, novel, or campaign book is probably sitting right here in the Delta/Gamma range. Your average sanctioned Psyker attached to an Imperial Guard regiment, Delta or Gamma. The court Psyker whispering in your planetary governor's ear, how Delta or Gamma. That guy in the Black Library novel who does one cool thing and then gets shot? You guessed it. Training for Psykers at these levels is no casual affair either. It involves being soul-bound, mind-scraped, and psychically branded by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The process can take years and has a mortality rate that makes it feel less like education and more like a prolonged execution with a graduation ceremony at the end. So, not exactly a university degree. Now here's where it gets a little messy. The assignment is a scale that runs from Alpha Plus at the top down through Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and so on to Omega at the bottom. Gamma sits above Delta. But different source materials across editions haven't always been perfectly consistent in how they present these tiers, and a lot of the community consensus comes from older Rogue Trader and 2nd edition materials that Games Workshop hasn't exactly rushed to update. So if you've ever gotten into a forum argument about the finer details, congratulations. Nobody won. Nobody ever will. But if you think human Psyker classifications are confusing, wait until you see what happens when orcs get Psyker psychic powers, because it makes zero sense and it's beautiful. Weird boys? Okay, forget everything you just learned about imperial classifications and rigid psychic hierarchies, because weird boys follow zero of those rules. Weird boys are orc psychers, and they operate on logic so backwards it actually loops around to making perfect sense. Here's how they work. Every orc generates a low-level psychic field called WAG, energy. It's ambient, passive, and mostly harmless on its own, but a weird boy acts like a living antenna for all of it. The more orcs fighting nearby, the more power gets funneled directly into their skull. 10 orcs brawling, minor headache. 1,000 orcs charging across a battlefield, the weird boy becomes a walking artillery piece capable of melting tanks with green psychic lightning. But here's where it gets genuinely hilarious. Most psychers in the galaxy actively seek out power and control over their abilities. Weird boys desperately want nothing to do with theirs. They're miserable. Other orcs avoid them because being near a weird boy when he overloads tends to end with everyone in the vicinity exploding. Weird boys carry copper staffs to try to ground the excess energy, and their clans keep them chained up or pinned in between battles so they don't accidentally vaporize the camp. Their existence is essentially being a bomb nobody wants to stand next to, which is, not ideal for social standing. They're rare among orc society, and you absolutely cannot sanction them. There's no ritual, no binding, no brand that works. They're not drawing power from the warp the way human psychers do. They're channeling a collective psychic field generated by an entire species that believes things into existence. Some fans argue they're not even true psychers at all, just green conduits for something much weirder. And honestly, that tracks. But if you think orc psychers are hard to classify, wait until you meet the Harlequin's Shadow Seers, because they make weird boys look straightforward. Shadow Seers. Every faction in 40k has psychers. Most of them follow rules. Shadow Seers don't even acknowledge the rulebook exists. These are the Harlequin Psychers, servants of the laughing god Segarech, and they operate so far outside normal psychic practice that calling them psychers almost feels like a category error. Where every other psyker in the galaxy treats the warp like a dangerous tool, something you grab with both hands and pray it doesn't bite you, Shadow Seers treat it like a canvas. They don't wrestle with psychic energy, they perform with it. And here's the thing, their numbers are vanishingly small. The Harlequins themselves are already rare among the Eldari, and Shadow Seers are the rarest role within that already tiny faction. That's not an army, that's a guest list. The most exclusive club in existence, and the membership requirements are so obscure that even the Eldari don't fully understand how someone becomes one. Their abilities seem to flat out violate the normal laws of psychic practice. They specialize in manipulating fear, confusion, and hallucination, weaving illusions so potent they can break minds on contact. They walk the webway using techniques that other psychers can't replicate or even comprehend. Farseers, who have centuries of training and psychic power that dwarfs most human psychers, look at Shadow Seers and basically shrug. They don't get it either. But the most fascinating part is what we don't know. The lore on Shadow Seers is intentionally thin. Games Workshop keeps their true power level deliberately obscured, and that's not lazy writing. That's the point. They're mysterious because mystery is their entire identity. Their connection to Segarach means they operate outside conventional psyker frameworks, which raises a question nobody can answer confidently. Are they even psychers at all? Or is something else entirely wearing the label? I don't know what to tell you. Nobody does. And that's exactly how Segarach wants it. But if the Shadow Seers represent the galaxy's most enigmatic psychers, the Imperium's Primaris psychers are the exact opposite. Blunt, sanctioned, and built for one thing. Primaris. Psychers. First things first, let's clear something up. Primaris psychers have absolutely nothing to do with Primaris Space Marines. Zero connection. Different word, different context, different everything. The community has been mixing these two up for years, and it needs to stop. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, Primaris Psychers are the Navy SEALs of the psychic world. Where regular sanctioned Psychers are your standard infantry, these are the Imperium's premium, handcrafted precision instruments of psychic warfare. Trained and soul-bound through the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, they represent some of the most powerful battlefield Psychers the Imperial Guard has access to. We're talking individuals strong enough to hurl lightning across a war zone, shield entire squads with psychic barriers, and do it all without immediately combusting, which in this universe counts as a major achievement. Their training is brutal and extensive, with many candidates not surviving the process at all. The ones who do emerge as psychers, who can maintain multiple psychic effects simultaneously, serve as senior psychic officers attached to Imperial Guard command structures, and personally operate in roles that would break a lesser mind in seconds. Here's what makes them genuinely rare. Primaris psychers are not common. Across the incomprehensible scale of the Imperium's military forces, there simply aren't enough of them. Losing even one is a serious strategic blow, because replacing replacing that level of psychic talent and training isn't something you can just requisition from a depot. That's an enormous amount of institutional investment walking around in one squishy human body, and that's the tension that makes them so fascinating. These are among the most valuable psychic assets the Imperial Guard can field, elite operators with grueling training and genuine strategic importance. But at the end of the day, a single bolter round still kills them. All that investment, all that training, gone in one unlucky moment, which is, not ideal. But if you think Primaris Psykers sit at the top of the food chain, wait until you hear what a full beta level Psyker can actually do. Beta level Psykers. Now we're getting into genuinely scary territory. Everything before this was dangerous, sure, but beta level Psykers are the first ones on this list who can walk onto a battlefield and actually reshape it. We're talking about individuals who can maintain psychic powers for extended periods, affect entire combat zones, and make hardened Space Marines pause before engaging. These are not party tricks. These are walking weapons. Beta level Psykers represent some of the most powerful human Psykers the Imperium can field. Cadian regiments were known for producing strong-willed soldiers across the board, which tells you something about the caliber of warrior that planet produced before. Well, before it stopped existing. Psykers brought into Imperial service undergo the soul-binding sanctioning process on Terra, a grueling ordeal that breaks many candidates entirely. So by the time one of these Psykers hits the field, they've been forged, tested, branded, and psychically chained to within an inch of their sanity. But here's the paradox that makes beta levels so fascinating. They can rip apart squads with their minds. They can hold psychic barriers against incoming fire. They can project force across terrifying distances, and a single bolter round to the chest kills them instantly. That's it. One well-placed shot and all that training, all those years, all that terrifying power just drops like a sack of wet laundry. They're glass cannons made of actual glass. Now, quick note. The assignment scale for Psyker classification has shifted and evolved across decades of lore. Games Workshop has never been what you'd call consistent with their Psyker tier system across editions and sourcebooks. But the Greek letter scale from Alpha Plus down through to negligible levels is the framework the community most commonly references, and Beta sits near the top of that hierarchy whether every single rulebook agrees on the exact details or not. Powerful as they are though, Beta level Psykers are still just humans with extraordinary gifts. The next entry on this list takes that same psychic potential and straps it inside a genetically enhanced, power-armored killing machine. Librarians. Take a Space Marine, a 7-foot genetically engineered killing machine already capable of ripping a man in half with his bare hands. Now give him psychic powers strong enough to make even seasoned human Psykers look like amateurs. Now ask yourself why the Imperium immediately decided to chain those powers down as hard as physically possible, because they're terrified of what they created. Librarians are the Psykers of the Adeptus Astartes, and on paper they sound like the ultimate weapon. A superhuman body fused with superhuman psychic ability, trained under their chapter's librarians for decades before they're even considered battle ready. Decades. Most sanctioned Psykers get a few years of training and a soul binding before the Emperor before they're thrown into a war zone. A librarian spends the better part of a lifetime just learning how to not explode. And here's the thing, most chapters only maintain a relatively small number of them at any given time. Out of 1,000 Space Marines, you get a handful of librarians, and every single one of them is wrapped in so many psychic wards, binding oaths and mental disciplines that they're basically prisoners inside their own skulls. Before a librarian can even serve, they have to endure grueling psychic trials designed to prove they can resist demonic possession and maintain absolute control. Fail, and you're done. Not reassigned, done. But here's where it gets complicated. The community has been arguing for years about whether librarians are actually better off than regular sanctioned Psykers. Sure, they're astronomically more powerful, but a sanctioned Psyker at least gets to use their abilities with some degree of personal agency. A librarian, the more powerful they become, the more rigid the psychic discipline and oversight their chapter imposes on them. Their greatest strength is literally their greatest prison. Every new tier of power reach is another layer of scrutiny added to the cage. They're not weapons that happen to be chained, they're chains that happen to contain a weapon. And if you think that sounds like a raw deal, wait until you see what happens when a Psyker throws those chains away entirely. Sorcerers. Every Psyker we've talked about so far has rules, limits, chains. The Imperium spends centuries building safety protocols, training regimens, and psychic wars to keep its Psykers from going nuclear. Chaos Sorcerers are what happens when you rip every single one of those protocols out and replace them with a handshake deal with the darkest forces in existence. And honestly, it works. That's the terrifying part. A Chaos Sorcerer's power varies varies wildly, but the strong ones can push into genuinely terrifying psychic territory. We're talking battlefield reshaping power. I can boil your blood from across the room power. And they didn't earn it through decades of careful training or soul-binding rituals. They earned it by saying yes to something they absolutely should have said no to. Here's the thing, the trait isn't just power for loyalty, it's power for everything. Their stability goes first, then their humanity. Corruption doesn't creep in slowly, like rust on a pipe. It floods in. It rewrites them at a foundational level, warping flesh and mind until what's left isn't really a person anymore. It's psychic power wearing human-shaped meat. There's no healing from that, no redemption arc, no I saw the light and came back. The corruption is permanent and structural, like trying to unbake a cake. The most powerful among them rise to command entire chaos warbands, serving as sorcerer lords or advisors to demon princes and warband champions. They're generals, scholars of forbidden knowledge, and weapons of mass destruction rolled into one screaming package. But here's where it gets genuinely concerning. Chaos doesn't need the infrastructure the Imperium does to produce Psykers. There's no black ships, no decades-long pipeline, no bureaucratic nightmare of sanctioning. Chaos just keeps a door open. No quality control, no safety inspections, no returns department. The average quality is lower, sure. Plenty of them burn out or get consumed by demons within weeks, but the barrier to entry is basically non-existent. Yeah, some fans argue sorcerers are victims. Others say they chose damnation with open eyes. The truth is probably both, which makes them worse. But if chaos represents psychic power with zero restraint, the Eldar represent the exact opposite. Discipline refined over millennia, wielded by minds older than most Imperial institutions. Farseers. Every Psyker we've talked about so far has one thing in common. They're all fighting corruption. The Warp wants to eat them, Chaos wants to twist them, and the Imperium wants to shoot them if they sneeze wrong. Farseers don't have that problem. They have a completely different one, and honestly, it might be worse. Eldar Farseers are Psykers who have walked the path of the Seer for centuries before they're even considered masters. Space Marine librarians train for decades and they're considered elite. A Farseer looks at that and goes, oh, you just started. The thing is, becoming a Farseer isn't really a choice. It's a trap. A Farseer is someone who walked the path of the Seer and became so deeply immersed they could never leave. Not because they don't want to, because the path won't let them go. The most powerful Farseers are among the strongest Psykers in the entire galaxy. A single Farseer can peer through the skein of fate and perceive branching probability timelines, seeing not just one future but hundreds of possible outcomes simultaneously, which sounds incredible until you realize what that actually does to a person. Here's where it gets tragic. Farseers don't go mad from chaos whispering in their ears. They go mad from knowledge. Over centuries, a Farseer begins to lose the boundary between probability and reality. Every death, every victory, every betrayal, all layered on top of each other forever. And eventually, their bodies slowly crystallize into Wraithbone, their consciousness fading into the craft world's infinity circuit. That's not corruption. That's just what happens when you look too hard at the truth of the universe. And on top of all that, every single Eldar carries a spirit stone because the moment they die, Slaanesh is waiting to devour their soul. So Farseers spent centuries mastering the most refined psychic discipline in the galaxy while knowing that one bad day means eternal consumption by a chaos god. Not ideal. One thing is clear. These are Psykers defined not by what corrupts them, but by what they already know. But if centuries of training and existential dread sound extreme, wait until you hear about the Psykers who make Farseers look restrained. Alpha plus Psykers. Fewer than 20. In the entire recorded history of the Imperium of Man, spanning tens of thousands of years and untold trillions of human beings, fewer than 20 Psykers have ever been confirmed as Alpha plus. That's not a rough estimate. That's the number. You could fit every Alpha plus Psyker who ever lived into a single elevator, and you'd still have room for a guy named Cornelius who just wants to get to the 3rd floor. And what does Alpha plus actually mean in practice? It means city-leveling psychic force. Not could theoretically damage a city block if they really concentrated. Full, flattened, nothing left. Where did that metropolitan area go? Levels of destruction. A single Alpha plus Psyker represents a strategic threat on par with orbital bombardment. They don't fight battles, they end them. Here's the thing though, most Imperial citizens will live their entire lives, from birth to death, without ever knowing an Alpha plus Psyker existed. These individuals operate at such extreme levels of secrecy that they're essentially mythology within the Imperium's own borders. Inquisitors whisper about them. High Lords pretend they don't exist. The average guardsman has a better chance of petting a Tyranid than ever encountering one. But here's where it gets complicated. Alpha Plus is the highest official classification on the assignment scale. The top of the chart, the ceiling, and there's nothing formally above it. The Emperor of Mankind is generally considered beyond the scale entirely. doesn't go high enough. Some of his Primarchs were powerful Psykers in their own right, Magnus the Rid being the most obvious example, but the Primarchs as a whole weren't all Psykers. They were superhuman warriors, not necessarily psychic ones. Still, the fact remains that the single most exclusive psychic classification ever devised, one that fewer than 20 humans have ever achieved, doesn't even begin to describe the being who designed the whole system. The community has picked this apart endlessly. Some fans argue that a classification so rare it barely applies to anyone is functionally meaningless. Others counter that the rarity is exactly the point. It's not a rank, it's a warning label. And the thing they're warning you about, the being that makes Alpha Plus look like a parlor trick, he's been sitting on a golden throne for 10,000 years. The Emperor of Mankind. Every single Psyker on this list exists because of him. Every librarian, every farseer, every screaming weird boy, every chaos sorcerer drunk on warp juice. They all operate in the shadow of one being, and that being has been a corpse for 10,000 years. The Emperor of Mankind sits on the golden throne. He has been sitting there since the Horus Heresy, which means he's been dead or dying, or whatever he is, for longer than most human civilizations have existed. His body is a husk. His skeleton is fused to a machine the size of a cathedral, and somehow, impossibly, he is still the most powerful psychic entity in the galaxy. Here's what it costs to keep him running. 1,000 Psykers are sacrificed to the golden throne every single day, not volunteers, sacrifices, fed into the machine to sustain whatever flicker of power keeps him functional. Every day, for 10,000 years. If you do the math on that, you land somewhere around 3.65 billion souls. That's not a god, that's a furnace. But here's the thing, without him, everything collapses. The Astronomicon goes dark, warp travel becomes impossible. The Imperium's million worlds lose contact with each other overnight. Every fleet, every crusade, every supply line gone. The entire stellar empire of humanity is tethered to one rotting corpse on a broken chair, and nobody can unplug him because unplugging him ends civilization. He transcends every classification on this list. Alpha Plus doesn't even begin to cover it. He can manifest his presence across the entire Imperium through sheer psychic will. Saints report seeing him. Soldiers feel his light in battle. Whether that's actual psychic projection or something closer to godhood is a question nobody can answer. And that's the central mystery of Warhammer 40K. Is the Emperor alive? Dead? A god who refuses the title? A weapon that outlived its purpose? The Imperium built an entire religion around him, the Imperial cult, and there's a very real chance he would despise every single part of it. He explicitly rejected worship during the Great Crusade, enforced the Imperial truth, and now his empire runs on the exact theocratic fanaticism he tried to stamp out. Nobody knows what he'd think of it now. Games Workshop will never tell you. That ambiguity isn't a flaw, it's the point. The darkest empire in fiction runs on faith in something that might not even be there anymore. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.